Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Welcome back. I'm Steve of the History of the Papacy podcast, and I am joined again by Patrick of the Forgotten Christianity Substack. We are continuing our discussion of Patrick's posts and series on the Norman invasion and its impact on the Church of the Anglo-Saxons, otherwise known as the English. This is a continuation of our previous conversations. Make sure to like and subscribe to Patrick's Substack, linked in the comments, and to the History of the Papacy podcast on YouTube, Podcatcher, Spotify, etc. So last time we followed a group of Anglo-Saxons who fled the persecution of the Norman conquest to find a New England, just not the New England you imagined. They found a new life in the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire, fighting for the emperor and starting an outpost on the Black Sea. But now let's shift our focus back to what was going on back in merry old England. And so, Patrick, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me, Steve. I appreciate it. Always enjoy our conversations.
Yeah, and this is going to be a good one. So let's start off with getting ourselves oriented back in England. So really the people, so this whole group of 10,000 English essentially split to go to the Eastern Roman Empire. What happened to those who stayed or couldn't go somewhere else?
So they were persecuted. They either got in line and did what the Normans told them, right? Or they were persecuted. They were thrown in jail, as I mentioned, I think in the last podcast or in the previous one as well. If you were clergy and you didn't behave, you didn't do what the Normans said, and you stuck around, you got your eyes gouged out and you got castrated. So, and keep in mind, for those who think, oh, well, what's castration if you're already a celibate priest? That wasn't the thing. Pre-Norman invasion, it was very common, as it is in the Orthodox Church, to have a wife if you were a clergy. Okay, so being castrated was a big deal. I mean, that actually pretty much tells you that there was that it wasn't that having the priestly celibacy came later after the Norman invasion. It did not predate it. So it doesn't mean that there weren't monastics. There were, of course, but it was very common for an English or a Celtic priest to be married. So there's one estimate that says that as many as 1 in 5 English were killed either through persecution, the sword, or famine, right, because of the Norman invasion. So. And then, of course, if you didn't behave, you got the result, the castration or gouging your eyes out. And then you were just replaced anyway, right? So pretty much all the bishops and abbots and a lot of the priests that were English were either they fled or they were replaced otherwise by force with Norman, clergy who were loyal to Rome. So the old Anglo-Saxon ecclesial order, right? Meaning locally governed, governed by synods or councils with deep roots going all the way back to Augustine of Canterbury, were pretty much being uprooted and thrown out, right? And at the same time, you have Pope Gregory VII, who is an awful pope, by the way. You should look him up. Terrible pope. You should see what his cardinals wrote. With his blessing, wrote about women who were married to priests, right? So the priests' wives, calls them whores, calls them all kinds of terrible names. Look it up. That's separate from what we're talking about here, but it's part of the Gregorian reform that was being pushed across the states, across the areas that were controlled by the papacy or governments loyal to the papacy. So So anyway, the English clergy were kind of getting hit by two directions, right? You got the Norman occupation, and then you got the Roman centralization, right? So it was pretty rough, actually, because within a generation, I think I mentioned last time, from 1066, not even 1066. I mean, the Battle of Hastings doesn't even happen until October 1066, and William the Conqueror, formerly known as William the Bastard, the true story, that I'm not making that up. He's not even crowned King of England until 1060 or till December, the Christmas Day, 1066. So really, but in 19 years, within like basically a generation, all of the property, the church property, anything that not just church, not just clergy, not just the church, but any kind of like Roman, Anglo-Saxon noble, anybody that owned land was gone. It was transferred almost completely. I mean, this is one of the most amazing things about this period. All of the property, all of the power was transferred within 20 years to the invading Normans. It's just fascinating. It's horrible and remarkable all at the same time. So it's I don't know. It's kind of fantastic to think about, right? That's like somebody coming in the early 2000s, and by 2026 you're completely wiped out.
Let's step aside from Normanization and Romanization. We're going to revisit that a lot later on. But there's a really interesting side tale, I guess you might say, about King Harold, the one who was shot in the eye or supposedly shot in an eye with an arrow at the Battle of Hastings, where his daughter, Princess Gita, fled and kind of weaves into essentially the history of the entirety of Europe, essentially, after this. So the Anglo-Saxons are really deeply embedded into the history of Europe to this very day.
Absolutely. It's very interesting. We talked about how a lot, fled to Scotland, to Scandinavia and other parts of Europe. And a ton of them went to Constantinople in the East. But yes, Princess Gita, the daughter of King Harold of England, not of Norway. Remember, there's two Harolds that fought just before Hastings. But King Harold of England, his daughter flees, because why wouldn't you, right? And she goes to Kievan Rus, right? She goes to Kiev. Which has obviously been in the news a lot lately with the Ukraine war, right? So, and remember at this time, the Kievan Rus, I mean, that's Russia. Okay. To be clear, like it's Greater Russia. There's no like, that's Ukraine and that's right. No, it's all one thing. Anyway, and it's pretty much the center of Orthodox Christianity. To be clear, the term Orthodox comes into more and more popular vernacular over the centuries to distinguish itself from Roman Catholicism. So, but back in the day, it was just a Christian. Okay. So, anyway, so she flees. She's a noble woman. She flees. She's the daughter of the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. She becomes a princess, Kievan Rus. She marries the prince there. And so basically she's weaving the English royal bloodline into the Slavic world, right? And again, as I mentioned, Kiev at the time, and for many, many centuries after that is a center of Christianity, of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, trade and so on, right? So it's really fascinating to say, like, okay, the bloodlines of the Anglo-Saxons and the bloodlines of the Russians essentially are blended together, because of the Norman invasion.
Hey, Steve here. If you're enjoying the History of the Papacy podcast, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. We're working toward going completely listener funded, which means no more ads ever. When you join, you get early access to episodes, monthly book giveaways, and most importantly, your name is added to the History of the Papacy Diptychs, our own list of commemorated supporters. You can become an Antioch level supporter for just $3 per month. but it makes a huge difference to making the history of the papacy ad-free and independent. Nobody likes ads, not you, not me, and I'm the guy who records them. So let's just get rid of them. Visit patreon.com/history of the papacy and join today. That's a really cool story, but now we're getting back into what was going on in England, and it's a rough time to be an Anglo-Saxon, and a few Anglo-Saxons are still writing. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle will go on for a few more years afterwards, but there's this guy Anonymous of York, which is an awesome name, and what was his... why would this person have to write under a pseudonym? Why not just write what he, write under his own name? And what were some of the things this Anonymous of York was writing about?
Sure. So this is, I love talking about Anonymous of York because he captures so well the sentiment that is going on within the displaced clergy of England, right? After the Norman invasion. He's writing about 1100 AD. So, 30, 40 years, give or take, after the Norman invasion, and a good 15, 20 years after, the native English have lost their titles, they've lost their lands and so on. We don't know his real name, which is why he goes by Anonymous of York. Why? Retribution, of course, right? He doesn't want to get castrated or have his eyes gouged out, right? So he's like, yes. I mean, it seems, but he is, nonetheless, he is obviously very upset. He's probably writing within, a circle, sympathetic to the old, of course he is, old Anglo-Saxon ecclesial order, right? The way it used to be. And so this kind of gives you actually a picture of how, the Great Schism just it wasn't like a lot, they signed a document or they slapped the papal bull down and, on the altar of Hagia Sophia and suddenly the church was split in two. No, it took decades, even centuries, for the church to fully separate itself, right? And you can see this with Anonymous of York. He's right. I'm going to say this. My Latin's not so good. Tractius Aberconzi. I can't even say it right. I mean, it's the tracts of the Anonymous of York is what it means in English. But he's writing. He is effectively criticizing the Pope, the reforms. He's lamenting in the overarching, kind of theme. He's lamenting they've lost autonomy to the papacy. Remember, because keep in mind, in the old order, before the papacy emerged and became what it is today and what everybody thinks about the Pope. Oh, the Pope is he's the universal, he's the vicar of Christ and all of that. That's not a thing at this time, right? Pre-schism. In fact, the Vicar of Christ isn't even a title he uses until like the 13th or 1400s, I think. I have to look, but it's much later. Anyway, the way the church developed from the beginning, from Christ and the apostles, is you had local bishops governing local areas. And then you had metropolitan bishops or bishops in big cities who had more influence, but they couldn't tell. You had five major bishoprics in the ancient church for the first 1,000 years. Basically, you had Rome, Antioch, you had Jerusalem, Constantinople, and Alexandria, Egypt. Right, those are the big five. The Bishop of Alexandria cannot tell the Bishop of Rome what to do. Now, he could advise him, but he couldn't tell him what to do, right? And the Bishop of Rome could not tell anybody else what to do. It's only when the Bishop of Rome thinks and gets in his head, oh, I can tell everybody what to do, that you have the Great Schism, right? So anyway, that said, that's kind of the idea. If you're getting back to Anonymous of York, he's thinking, we govern locally, right? Government is best when it's local. That's true of church. It's true It doesn't mean you shouldn't have higher powers and you shouldn't have, church structure and everything, but to basically have everything top down is pretty rough, right? And so he's complaining about this. He is, it's not entirely directed at Pope Gregory VII, but he's one of the most consequential popes it's why it's called the Gregorian Reform, right? Because it's named for him. Gregory VII fundamentally reshapes the relationship of the church with the secular rulers across Europe, right? It's a conflict that's known as the investiture controversy, which means how do you appoint and govern the church? How do you appoint, bishops? How do you appoint, priests and so on? And it used to be kind of it was conciliar, and also, the kings and queens of England or of Europe had a role in this, right? But no more after Gregory VII. So he is, his biggest complaint, getting back into the, what is Agnus of York complaining about? What is he writing about? Simony, right? Or simony, I should say. The selling of church offices, general greed. He writes that Rome has turned the church into a marketplace. You can just buy it, right? It's on sale to the highest bidder. He calls the Roman church, quote, a harlot and a den of thieves. He paints this very vivid picture. And remember, simony takes its name from Simon Magnus. He's the sorcerer in the book of Acts, who tries to buy spiritual power from the apostles, right? And so anyway, that's one of his biggest complaints is simony. The second is the replacement of English clergy with foreigners. We talked about this already, right? They're coming in and they're displacing all of the native English with these foreigners who don't live by English laws, don't live by English custom, and they only take their marching orders from Rome, right? So they're just placing everybody. It's the same thing. I mean, the Normans are doing this across the board, right? They're not doing this just in the church. They're doing this in government as well, right? So it's a universal wiping the slate clean, or the slate clean. Excuse me. Another argument he makes, he defends the old English practice of synods, right? Like, it's very conciliar, church councils, because now they're moving into an era where the Pope says jump and you say how high, right? As opposed to we do everything by church council, right? Which is the way they had historically done it in across, and we still do in the Eastern Church. There's no one person that can say, oh, everybody has to do this. No, it's not how that works. And that's not how it worked for 1,000 years in Christianity. It's not how and this is why he's upset, right? Because now he's moving into they're moving into an era where, the Pope of Rome gets to tell them everything, what to do, what to say, how to act, and so on. So, and he actually even compares the English church, to Joseph being sold into slavery, but in Egypt by his brothers, right? It's a very interesting picture.
What I think is really interesting about this time period is that it almost seems like the papacy at this time is using England as a test case for a new version of the papacy coming out of the pornocracy period, or the secula obscurum of the 900s, where the papacy was just such a disaster. You get the Gregorian reforms, which were in a lot of ways necessary reforms, but this matched with the Cluniac reforms of this whole thing that was really homogenizing all of the West, or turning it into almost like they wanted to create a church that was like McDonald's, that you're going to do the liturgy this way, and you're going to do this way, and you're going to run your monasteries this certain way. And England seemed like the perfect test case for it, because they had bumped out all of the locals. They're all gone. Their whole idea of synodality is, I think they would call it today in the Roman Church, or conciliarism, wasn't working, or it wasn't working the way that the Pope wanted to. In this, I think that when you really get down to it, you have to remember that the Pope of Vatican I and the Pope of today, that really didn't exist in the 1100s. It was something that grew in fits and starts and really doesn't fully emerge until the First Vatican Council in the 1860s. I think you have to, but those seeds were starting to get planted right here.
And you can see absolutely. You can see the trajectory of the papacy, which is very fascinating, as you well know, like going from I'm a normal bishop to I'm a metropolitan type bishop where I have a lot of influence, but still I don't control everything, to being the mouthpiece and in control of the entire continent, the Western continent of the western side of the European continent, right? So yeah, and you don't get a lot of to your point, you don't get a lot of the sort of modern, the Pope is infallible and all that stuff until Vatican I, right? 1871. So but even before that, the Pope had a massive amount of power, and it really starts to emerge now. And as a test case, to your point, and maybe it's because it's an island. I don't know, but yeah, you get this over 30, 40 years, really 20 years. So I've said before, like a complete change in direction of the entire church, right? And where they changed virtually everything. They even changed. They even we talked about, and I think in a previous conversation, they changed the language that churches that the liturgy is in, right? Instead of being in the vernacular of the people, now it's in Latin more often than not, or even French, which no one understands because they're not French except for the people that just came in. And so radical change. And then historians are pretty much in the universal agreement on this. Between 1100 AD and 1200 AD, so 40 to 140 years after the invasion, the Norman invasion, Western Europe is radically changed. Like if you were living in Western Europe in 1100 and you managed to make it to 1200, you would not even recognize it. That's how radical the change was. Just a massive change across everything. And that was due to the papacy and the church and the way they changed everything.
So Anonymous of York, he doesn't have many kind things to say about the papacy. And what is the significance historically? Was he just angry, or did he have some really legitimate points, or was it a little bit of everything there?
It's a little bit of everything there. Of course, he's angry. He is, he's been displaced. Maybe he's even, there's some speculation, or at least I'm speculating, that he's still serving in the church, but being quiet about it, so that he can keep his position, he keeps his head down, but then he's also really upset about it. And so he writes it anonymously, his complaints. But I think that, I think he's angry. Absolutely. I think that, you look at his arguments and they're very, very valid. They're changing things. It's the whole thing is switching, from the way it was, conciliar to, very, very much top down. He's very, very upset. And I love his colorful language, right? I mentioned a moment ago that, he likens, what's going on in England at this time to, Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers, into Egypt, right? Which turned out to be, in the end, a good thing. But he's framing it like a betrayal, right? It's a spiritual crime. It's, Joseph was sold for silver. Anonymous is connecting that directly to Rome, selling church offices for the price of silver, right? So, I mean, this is along the same lines of indulgences, all the things that 5 centuries later that Martin Luther is going to squawk about and light the fire of the Protestant Reformation, right? These are the beginnings of it. I mean, you literally have, without the papal Reformation of the 11th century, you're not going to have the Protestant Reformation of the 16th. It's a direct correlation, right? And a lot of people don't think about it that way. They think about, Protestant Reformation is kind of a standalone. No, it's not. It's the direct cause was the papal Reformation. It was the papacy becoming what it was, created the catalyst that eventually became the Protestant Reformation. So it's really, really fascinating, this time period, because the change is so rapid. So I think that's one thing that why he's upset, and what people need to understand, about this time in history in England is like, it happens so fast and so quickly, and it's so drastic that it's completely forgotten by other future generations. Like, people think that, England was always Roman Catholic. Roman Catholic wasn't even a thing, before the Great Schism, right? So, but people forget that it was essentially the original church. It was effectively Orthodox, although they wouldn't describe it like that, right? But venerating icons and all the things that we do in the Eastern Church, that's what was going on in England prior to the Norman invasion.
So you describe Anonymous as standing at a crossroads. What do you mean by that? What are the crossroads that he's standing at?
Well, he's looking at, he's at a crossroads because he's looking back. The reason I say that is he's looking back at what was, right? And what, if you get, so it's a crossroads because if you keep with the trajectory, we're going to be something completely different and totally different than what we were if we don't change direction. Looking back at what he had and what was, if we don't change our trajectory, and they didn't, they became something other than what they were, right? Something completely new and different, right? It's not unlike, the Protestant Reformation was a crossroads. Had the Reformation been squashed, they would have stayed on the same road that they were on, and Western Europe would have continued to be Roman Catholic, right? Completely. If on the other hand, and what happened was that the Protestant Reformation took the turn at this crossroads, and boom, went this direction. It created tens of thousands of different denominations, and it splintered the church. Probably irreparably, maybe, I don't know. But it changed the direction completely. And I think that Anonymous, to me, is at that crossroads. He's saying, hey guys, this is something that we need to address. We need to think about, because we are going away from the old ways. And if we don't change things, we're going to become something completely different, and it's not good.
I think it's very interesting because somebody like Anonymous of York could have become, with a slightly different technology. And when we were off air, we were talking about technology. He really didn't have the ability to get his ideas out there that maybe somebody like Martin Luther did, that was able to send this message out. And the Catholic Church, which was pretty good in a lot of ways of reforming. It was just slow at reforming. And they didn't have the opportunity with Martin Luther to reform. But speaking of Martin Luther, but going back to Anonymous of York, who was his audience, and how did his writing survive down to us to this day?
That is a good question. I actually don't know the answer to how it survived. I can tell you that there aren't very many copies, and it's mostly in Latin. And so his audience, though, was of course other church, other clergy, I don't know if he intended the Pope to read it, but it was certainly other clergy, people that could read. Because remember, at this time, and other, mainly clergy, and I would have to assume also nobles and other people that held his, his sympathies, right, for the old ways. But he's not, it's not going far and wide, right? And so the thing that I always, I love talking about the Reformation because it's such a fascinating period. But Anonymous of York, to your point, he doesn't have the mechanism by which he can do a blog post and boom, everybody in the world can see it. Or in the case of Martin Luther, he can print the thing. He can put it on the 95 Theses on the door at Wittenberg Castle. He can print it. And it can be distributed in little pamphlets all across Europe at lightning speed compared to even just a few, maybe 100, printing press is 1453, right? Martin Luther's less than 100 years after that. He's like 60 years, 70 years, right? Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation does not happen without the printing press. It does not happen without the printing press.
Yeah.
If you did not have the printing press, Martin Luther squawks a bit and he gets smacked down by his local bishop, and that's the end of it, right? If Anonymous of York had a printing press, who knows what would have happened? It certainly would have been pigeonhole, memory hold, not pigeonhole, but memory hold into the bin of, dustbin of history, right? Like the old English culture was, and what he was yelling about and what he was complaining about and writing against, none of that would have happened in the way that it happened if he had a way to get his voice out, right? So
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. If you had to make a conclusion to this series at this point, where really the Anglo-Saxon church clearly isn't dead because it existed if you listen to our last episode, in the Eastern Roman Empire, and it was, it was a substrate in the Norman church, but concluding this era of the Anglo-Saxons in the church, especially of England, what's your conclusion of this pretty tumultuous time period?
To bring it all full circle and wrap it up in a nice, neat bow. I think that the history of this era, is super important because it shows that it kind of encapsulates how, an entire church, an entire culture, an entire people were completely and effectively wiped off the map, right? From everything, from a theological standpoint, from a political standpoint, from a language standpoint. If you've ever listened to, and you can see this on, there are different memes and stuff on X and, Instagram and stuff where people will actually speak in Old English. You can't actually understand it. You and I, if you've ever read Chaucer, right? Canterbury Tales, for example, I did in college. It's hard to read. And that's actually even 250 years after the Norman invasion, when you have a whole influx of French. So the reason we have so many Latin phrases and French phrases and all of that is because of the Normans, right? We're speaking the language that they helped create. So in a very real and holistic way, Anglo-Saxon English was completely wiped out in a matter of a few decades, right? Effectively. Now, again, we talked about how it lived on. They lived on in Constantinople and other places in the East for several hundred years, but eventually they were swallowed up by those different cultures, right? The Russians and, and the Greeks, of course. But yeah, you see an entire culture just completely wiped out through this invasion, and it's only through some of the written stuff that we have left that's survived, right? Like for, for example, from Anonymous, right? I think you can get his, one of the few copies of his manuscript is in Cambridge, right? At Corpus Christi College. and that itself is a miracle because it managed to survive, the two purgings of the monasteries. Of course, the one by the Normans where they took everybody out and they memory hold all of many of the English saints from the first 1,000 years of Christianity, right? But then, of course, under King Henry VIII, he dissolved all the monasteries, in the 1530s and 40s, during the Protestant Reformation, and they ransacked, just obliterated, the libraries that were housed in these monasteries. And keep in mind, the monasteries protected through the Middle Ages in the West, especially, they protected the knowledge and the books and the manuscripts and all the things that a lot of other people had forgotten. Right. And so yeah, I think the big, kind of a long-winded way to conclude and to say, everything about this period is you just watched a complete society dissolve, and it lives on in it's gone. It will never come back. It's a piece of history that we can look back on, but you really have to look for it. It's not something that intuitively. It's not something that you're taught. Like, you learn about the Norman invasion in school, for example. Did you learn that they destroyed the church too when you learned about the Norman invasion? No, you didn't learn that, right? Because that's pushed aside and either covered up or, maybe not intentionally, but it's overlooked. Right. So why does it matter for modern Christians? I think it matters because, especially here in the United States, and in the West in general, England and Scotland and Ireland, especially, your roots aren't Roman Catholic. Your roots are Orthodox Christianity. Right. That's what's so mind blowing about this is what's practiced today in the Eastern Church is what you had in the West prior to the Norman invasion.
I mean, I've learned a ton just in these last 4 episodes, and there's a lot more to come.
Yes. Thank you again, Steve, for having me on. I look forward to our next conversation. And yeah, just to echo, what you just said, I love writing about this. It took me, I've been researching all this stuff for a good 15, 20 years. But I'm a historian. I have a degree in history. I'm not a theologian, which is why I like to focus on the history of things. Like, what does the historical record tell us about the church, about Christianity, about, our faith? And I think that's why this history, especially for people in America who many millions and millions of Christians in America trace their ancestry to the British Isles, right? Myself included. In fact, most of my ancestors come from the British Isles. So it's very important to me personally. And I think is important to many, many Christians if they knew about it. Right. And so that's what I'm trying to do is raise awareness about this beautiful part of history that, unfortunately got destroyed and we never learned about.
Yeah, I think that, maybe somebody might get hung up with this Orthodox Christian or Catholic, but something clearly changed, and something had clearly changed in the Catholic Church, in what is probably better to call it the Latin Roman, that there was something very much had changed after that really terrible 10th century 900s. And a very different church came out of that crucible, you might say.
Absolutely. It is fascinating, extremely fascinating. I will recommend, I'll plug a book by Father John Strickland. He does a series of the history of the church. But it's the second in the series. I'm blanking on the name of it right now. I should know this, but he basically tracks the history of the church from the Great Schism to the Reformation, and you see it. I mean, the change that happened through the Gregorian reforms, right, that we've been discussing in these last few episodes. The radical change, The Gregorian reforms brought about, priestly celibacy, universal priestly celibacy. They brought about, top-down control from the papacy. Kings and queens were bowing and kissing the ring of the Pope, like they never were before. All those kinds of things. Simony that we talked about, right? Buying of church offices, indulgences can emerge, and then you get scholasticism, which radically. This is in the 1200s. This is Saint Thomas Aquinas, right? Radically changes the way people think about the faith, right? They try to rationalize it. They try to put it in human terms. And it really changes the way you think about the faith. So all these things, age of division thing, it's called the age of division. So, anyway, by Father John Strickland, but it's a fantastic book, fantastic series. If you really want to delve into the nitty gritty and really get down to how did this change? And he even talks about in that book, how the art, and this is one of the things I find so fascinating. If you look at just the art of the medieval church, the art reflects the theology, and you can see just on a very high level, if you look at Byzantine, I hate the words Byzantine, Eastern Roman or Byzantine art, it's Christ, it's Christ Pantocrator, right? It's Christ victorious, right? If you look, the shift in the medieval church in the West, they start to focus a lot more on his suffering, on a lot more on those aspects of Christ. Not that that's not important, but you see it in the art. It's penitentiary. It's he died for you. You're an awful sinner. You need to pay indulgences to atone for your sins. And I mean, it goes a whole different direction. As opposed to what remains the same in the East from the beginning, right? So it's really, really fascinating stuff, at least to me.
I remember I never really knew much about church art or, the very basics, but I was at the Met in New York City, and you're in the one room, and in that one room, it's all Christian, Western Christian church art. And within 3 paintings, you can see an absolutely dramatic, somebody who's as unschooled in art and as I am and iconography as I am could see holy smokes, things had changed within half of a wall in this museum. You have a very distinct style to something that is very Renaissance, 3-dimensional, like you said, very, I guess, sensual, not meaning in the sensory way, that it had very much changed in. Even somebody as unlearned as I am could see that there was definitely a theological message, and I think the progression that they were trying to make is that was modernity, and that they were looking at art. But I think something got lost in that art.
It 100% got lost, and the magisterium was removed, right? And that's what eventually, the mystery of it all, in the Eastern Church, we talk about the holy mysteries, right? And that's sacraments of the holy mysteries, right? Communion, confession, marriage, et cetera, et cetera. In the West, they try to describe it all, right? And they're trying to transubstantiate. That's where you get transubstantiation. They're trying to explain everything away, maybe not away, but they're trying to explain everything when they don't really need to, right? And so it's a very different way of looking at things. And so, this reminds me of, I went to Europe before we were Orthodox. I went to Europe and really enjoyed it. Went to different churches and stuff, and was amazed by everything. And then I became Orthodox. And the thing I realized as you're going to these ancient churches, if the church, and do this, if you go to Europe, go into an ancient church, a church that either is about the time that was built about the time of the schism, or even anything pre-schism, and you will see if you look closely, if it's a Catholic church, for example, well, it had to be a Catholic church, but or in England it would be an Anglican church. Look past sort of the more modern Catholic stuff, but you're going to see the more ancient, icons that look very much, they're very Byzantine. They're very, you can see that it was an ancient church, right? For example, if you go into Westminster Abbey, most of the stuff is, post, there's a lot of stuff that's post-Reformation, but there's a lot of stuff that predates the Reformation, right? Because the church is it's like 1100 years old. Go to the most ancient part of the church, and it's not exactly Byzantine icons, but it's very close. And you can kind of see even the progression there of in the ancient part of the church, you have these kind of icons and these kind of pictures. And then the rest of the church, you have stuff that's more modern and more sensory and more, all those kinds of things. Right. So, it's really wild to look at. So another one quick example, and then we can wrap up here. But, if you go to the church, St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, right? The famous church that you've seen a million times in all these movies and stuff. They have it was the modern building that you see there was built in 10 right at the same time as the Norman invasion, 1066, right about, or 1064. Very, very close. So that's about 10 years after the Great Schism. Now, remember, as we talked about before, it takes decades, even centuries, for the church to really break apart. And so if you go into that church and you look past into the holy place, and even there's a whole wing dedicated to Theotokos, they've got an icon from Constantinople as the focal point in the eastern or the left side of the church, right? She has a whole wing to herself, right? And it's really fantastic to see. But that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, right? Go to those ancient churches, even if they're Catholic or Anglican, if they predate the schism, you're going to see all that stuff. It's really quite fantastic.
Yeah, we could go on. I think we have a subject here in the works of art, but we will definitely get into all of these topics and more. If there's something that a question or a comment or an idea you have, definitely reach out to us. All of the contact information will be in the show notes. Patrick, I want to thank you again, and we'll talk to you next time.
The Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.